Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about are zeros of polynomial functions. Now when we talk about zeros, or also known as roots, these are the things that pop out at us when we solve a polynomial, okay? So these are solutions to a polynomial, okay? Now a zero, or a root, is what we find when we set the polynomial equal to 0, okay? So one way we can find it is by solving a polynomial. The other way that we can find a zero is when we're given a graph, okay? A zero of a function is where the function crosses the x-axis. So in these three spots here, you see that this function crosses the x-axis. These are going to be the zeros. It looks to me like, if I estimate this, our zeros are at an x value of -2, an x value of -1, and an x value of 0. Okay? So when I'm given this function, if I solve it, those should be the solutions that I find. Okay? So here is the function. X to the third times x plus 2 squared plus times x plus 1. So what I want to do is I want to first of all set this thing equal to 0. Notice that I'm putting a 0 right over here. Okay, so I'm setting it equal to 0. Now I'm going to solve it. Now there's this thing called the zero product property. Okay, the zero product property basically says if you have three things all being multiplied together, like we do here, we have the x to the third, that's being multiplied by the x plus 2 squared, and then that is also being multiplied by the x plus 1. I have three different things all being multiplied together. The zero product property says, okay, if any of those three parts are equal to 0, then the whole thing is equal to 0, because 0 times anything is 0. So for that reason, you see over here, we set each part equal to 0. Okay? They put that right here. And then the second part, we set that equal to 0. And then the third part, we set that. So you just set all three parts equal to 0. So when I solve each of these separately, okay, when I solve the first part, well, the question just becomes, okay, what to the third power, oops, let me make that yellow. What to the third power equals 0? Well, that would just be 0. When I look at the second one, the question becomes, what plus 2 would be 0? Because 0 squared is 0. So -2 plus 2 is what would give me a 0 there. And then in the last one, -1 plus 1 gives me 0. So those are my three zeros. Those are my three solutions. So now when I look back at that graph from the previous slide, we'll check it out. We guessed, or we thought, that, yeah, 0 and -1 and 2, it looked like on our graph were going to be our solutions. So when we factored it out, whoops, I guess when I go back to this, now I have to click on all these. So when I factored it out and I solved it, I get the same thing. So zeros can be found by solving or by graphing and looking at the x-intercepts. Okay. So now there's this thing called multiplicity, and this is the number of times that a 0 appears. It sounds more complicated than it really is. So if you look at this function right here, f of x equals x squared times x minus 3 to the first power. I know I'm going to have two different solutions. I'm going to have a solution here and a solution here. Here, my x is going to equal 0. Okay? And over here, my x is going to equal 3, because 3 minus 3 is 0. Now here's this idea of multiplicity. 0 has a multiplicity of 2 because of the squared. Okay, so because this is squared, it has a multiplicity of 2. Now the x equals 3 is just going to have a multiplicity of 1 because the x minus 3 was raised to the first power. Well, what does that have to do with our graph? Well, here's what it has to do. If you have a multiplicity of 2, or 4, or 6, or 8, then you notice when you come up to the x-axis, you don't cross over the x-axis, you bounce off of it and go right back down to where you came from. So as you approach from this way, I'm not going to cross the x, I'm just going to hit it and go down. And then as I come back up over here, because the multiplicity of 3 was a 1, a multiplicity of 1 means that you just go right through that x-axis. So zeros are either going to bounce off of the x or go through the x. If I go back to my previous example and I look at this graph, notice, let me bring these up, open these up. See the blue part? The blue part up here was x plus 2 squared. So for my x, or my 0 of negative 2, notice that it bounces off and goes right back up. And that's all because of this squared right here. But these other two were not squared. So here I went right through it. I guess I'll move that one over here. So at 0, I went right through it. And at negative 1, I went right through it. Okay? So that squared is going to make your 0 bounce, your intercept bounce. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's work through this one. So right here, I'm going to have a 0 of negative 3. Right here, I'm going to have a 0 of negative 1. And over here, I'm going to have a 0 of negative 4. So those are my zeros. These are my zeros. Now, as far as the multiplicity goes, these are all odd-numbered exponents. 1, 3, and 1. So the multiplicity is only going to be once for all these. So all of these are going to go through the x-axis when I graph this. Okay? They're not going to bounce. They're going to go through the x-axis. If any of them were squared or fourth or sixth, then it would bounce off and go back where it came from. Okay, so the last one here. Let's look at example 4. So the first thing I have to do, I want to factor it, find the zeros, and determine multiplicity. So if I look at this, first thing I have to do is set it equal to 0. Okay, now I need to factor it. Well, when I look at these, I see that all three terms have an x in it. So I'm going to start by taking out an x. That's the greatest common factor of x. So I divided out an x for all of these. My next step, as you recall, if I have an exponent of 1 or a coefficient of 1, I'm looking for two numbers that add to give me the middle and multiply to give me the third. So when I do that, I'm going to get an x minus 2 times x minus 2. Let me sneak that in here so you can see. So the two numbers that add to give me negative 4 and multiply to give me positive 4 are a minus 2 and a minus 2. So they wrote it as x minus 2 squared. So my zeros are going to be x equals 0 here, and x equals 2 here. This is going to have a multiplicity of 1. It's going to cross once. Actually, let me just write it as 1. And this over here is going to have a multiplicity of 2.